Welcome to Inside the BACB, the official podcast of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Jim Carr, the CEO of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. Thanks for listening to Inside the BACB. On this episode, I'll be sharing a follow-up to our March 24 newsletter announcement. This pertained to changes to the 2027 DEI requirements for BCBA and BCABA certification, and I'll be providing some more context on the rationale that went into the changes. To start, I want to acknowledge that our announcement hurt and disappointed a number of our certificates and stakeholders. We understand that because we weren't happy about having to make these changes, and this includes the BACB staff, our board of directors, and our subject matter experts. To a person, we were dismayed to be even having these conversations. Now, that said, everyone involved in the process supported the changes, but no one was happy about having to make them at all. So I'd like to briefly recap the changes. They apply to 2027 BCBA and BCABA eligibility requirements for Pathway 2, that's our coursework pathway, and to 2027 BCBA and BCABA CEU requirements. Now let's start with the eligibility requirements. What was originally planned for 2027 was a requirement that DEI content be integrated into the course content areas for behavior assessment and intervention, organizational behavior management, and ethics. We hadn't yet specified what DEI content or how much of it needed to be integrated into these course content areas. Over the past few years, there's been a flurry of activity in state legislatures to restrict DEI activity on college campuses. There have been over 100 of these bills introduced in state legislatures in just the past 3 years, and a number of them have become law. Some of these laws explicitly prohibit including DEI content in university coursework. Now, I've spoken with faculty in some of these states, and they report being in a difficult position of having to teach content required by the BACB and potentially breaking state law. What was clear from these conversations is that the DEI content was not going to be taught at all, and that raises interesting questions about whether we could accept applications from graduates of these programs if they didn't meet our standards. Now, at the BACB, we've been studying anti-DEI legislation at the state level for about 4 years. The initial laws mainly focused on prohibiting DEI offices on university campuses, but recent laws have shifted to the curricula themselves. We anticipated possible future conflict around these laws, so we reached out to the organization that accredits the BACB's 3 certification programs. We asked them specifically if we could offer 2 sets of standards. The first set would be the main set, and the second would be those requirements minus DEI content for universities and states with restrictive laws. Our accreditation organization was clear that we can only operate 1 set of requirements in our certification programs. So when states actually started prohibiting DEI being taught in the classrooms and us learning that we could only offer 1 set of requirements, clearly something had to change. And recently, the psychology, law, engineering, and business professions have made various modifications to their DEI requirements for some of the same reasons. Some content can just no longer be taught in university classrooms in some states, and some of their requirements actually conflict with other laws and restrictions. Now, our new requirements for 2027 no longer include explicit content on DEI. However, they do require content on cultural and contextual responsiveness in the behavior assessment and intervention and OBM course content areas. These are requirements that do not currently exist. Now, we recognize and appreciate the dissatisfaction associated with not explicitly requiring DEI content in courses, but the 2027 requirements still represent an elevation over our current requirements, and they satisfy our accreditation restrictions and permit faculty in some states to still teach coursework for BCBA and BCABA certification without jeopardizing their jobs or their training programs. Okay, now the other changes made to 2027 requirements related to continuing education. We originally planned to require BCBAs and BCABAs to earn 2 CEUs on diversity, equity, inclusion in each 2-year certification cycle, so 1 hour per year. The new plan is to not have a DEI category because that's considered a mandate. Instead, we've added cultural and contextual responsiveness as a category within the ethics CEU category. Now, a CEU provider can place the highly valued ethics CEU badge on events that are exclusively about cultural responsiveness, even if the content doesn't directly relate to ethicality. Now, this admittedly means that fewer certificates will come into contact with DEI-related CEU content compared to the original plan, but it's still an improvement over our current requirements because everyone needs 4 ethics CEUs each cycle, and some of these will likely be on cultural responsiveness. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges we would likely face as a result of an explicitly DEI-related CEU requirement. There's at least one current U.S. law that restricts certain DEI content from mandatory continuing education requirements, and we anticipate more of these to come. But outside of state legislatures, there has emerged another source of barrier to offering DEI continuing education, and that source resides in state licensure programs. The BACB certification programs, especially BCBA certification, has become for many a ticket to licensure. There are currently about 73,000 BCBAs and BCABAs in the United States, and 2/3 of them live in one of the 38 states with licensure. Now, once a state passes a licensure law, that state license is now the most important professional credential for a practitioner. If you lose a state license or can't obtain one originally, you cannot practice, period. Now, in the past half year alone, there have been multiple threats to BACB certification as the basis of licensure due to the 2027 DEI requirements. This includes existing licensure programs that already recognize BACB certification as a pathway to licensure and legislative attempts to enact new licensure laws. In these situations, existing regulators have reacted negatively to learning that the BACB certification programs that they already recognize would soon include mandatory DEI requirements. We've also heard state legislators considering new licensure also react negatively to learning this information. Now, you might be wondering, at least on the CEU front, why doesn't the BACB just fight these efforts rather than change requirements? The reason is that it's virtually impossible for a company like the BACB, or anyone really, to bring a challenge against a state government in a situation like this. In the U.S., states have what's called sovereign immunity, and this prevents lawsuits against states unless certain conditions exist. These conditions just would not cover a company like the BACB suing a state because, let's say, they no longer recognize BACB certification for licensure eligibility or failed to pass a licensure law because of DEI requirements. If we had not changed our requirements and these negative outcomes occurred, state associations, if they exist at all, would likely have to lobby their legislatures and enact new legislation to change the situation. But if their licensure regulators or state legislators made that initial decision, this would likely be an uphill battle. And in the meantime, BACB certificates would not qualify for licensure. This would stagnate the workforce and limit services to consumers, and the situation could stay that way for years. Now, the BACB's primary mission is consumer protection through its standards, and the BACB has an additional obligation to keep protecting the value of the certifications that people have worked so hard to achieve. So imagine a situation where, for example, no new BCBAs or relocating BCBAs could earn licensure in a state. This would result in compromised services, reduced access to services, and likely a large number of geographic relocations. This would be a devastating outcome, and unfortunately, it's just not one the BACB could effectively fight at all due to state sovereign immunity. So in the end, it was a combination of state laws and actions from state regulators and legislatures against a backdrop of so much anti-DEI activity at the federal level that really demanded a revision of our requirements. If there had been a path that would have allowed all of our faculty to safely and legally teach DEI requirements in our course content areas, and to allow the BACB to actively fight efforts to limit recognition and licensure, we certainly would have taken it. But our board conducted a risk-benefit analysis, and the risks were just too great. So instead, we've taken a pragmatic course of action that will likely neutralize the current threats while still leveling up our coursework and CEU requirements above where they currently are. Now, these new requirements, combined with the content on cultural responsiveness and sensitivity that already exist on our test content outlines and in our ethics codes, they represent a collective improvement across our requirement areas for the 2020s compared to earlier years. And since the BACB's requirements now include language similar to those of other professions, should there be challenges to them in the future, the BACB would likely have a number of major allies assisting toward a solution. And let's not forget, the BACB's requirements are minimums. So universities, where they can, and CEU providers can always go much further than required, and we hope they do. So to reiterate, we understand that many are unhappy with our announcement, and we understand that unhappiness. But I hope this additional context provides more rationale for the changes that were made. And again, no one involved in these changes was happy about them. The alternative simply carried too much risk. Some have characterized our changes as constituting a statement from the field or profession of applied behavior analysis about DEI. I just want to remind everyone that the BACB's role is to provide a certification service to our profession. Our professional associations like ABAI and APBA have members that they represent, and they're the ones whose actions speak for our profession and our discipline. Their statements, their programs, the journal articles included in the journals they publish, and their convention schedules all show a commitment to DEI and related content. So I encourage our listeners to engage with those organizations to further the activities in this area. Doing so will only strengthen our profession's position, if you will, on this area. Thanks for listening today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Inside the BACB. Don't miss future episodes. Subscribe now.